Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's another landscape in colored pencil, and it's a colorful sunrise. I mostly worked with Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and I worked on 1000 grit sandpaper. Let me show you how it was done. As I'm sketching and working out the composition, let me say a few more words about the materials. As I've mentioned, I'm working on regular hardware store sandpaper. It's a 1000 grit sandpaper, and the size that I cut it to is about, 7 times 11 inches or so. And first I did a bit of sketching to decide where the line of the horizon will be. And then I started putting in some of the lighter details, mostly where the sun will be, because that's going to be the lightest part, or at least the part where the sun is breaking through the clouds is going to be the lightest part of the drawing. And because my background color is pretty dark, the lighter colors will show up nicely against it. But at the same time, I will need to cover these darker areas a bit more thoroughly, just so that I wouldn't get too many of those greyish tones, and so that those greyish tones wouldn't come through the bright colors that I'm trying to achieve. Anyway, once I've put in the lightest lights in, I worked around them with slightly darker colors, but still very bright colors like this yellowish orange, and then the regular orange color, or this reddish orange. I'm not really sure what its name or designation is in the Faber-Castell range. I don't know all of them by heart. If you're using slightly different pencils, you can just use an equivalent or something. Now I want to say a few more words about my pencils. Mostly I'm going to be using Faber-Castell Polychromos, but in addition to them I may also use some other Faber-Castell pencils and some Staedtler pencils as well. And I'm going to get to the reasons why I used some other pencils a little bit later, but I want to get back to the drawing process now. I use this light cool gray, whatever it is, for a good portion of this top part of the sky, because I needed a light color that's kind of cool, but I'm going to add some other tones to it. Now here around this light part where the sun is breaking through, I needed a light color, but a color that is slightly warmer, so I tried with this cinnamon color. And of course I'm always blending with Totilians, and these Totilians do work on sandpaper, but you have to bear in mind that they will produce different effects from what you would expect, different colors from those that you put down, because when you use a Totilian against this sandpaper, you get a slightly different shade, slightly different color. But I just kept experimenting and playing around with different colors until I got the tones that I wanted. Sometimes these tones would be a little bit cooler, sometimes I would have to add a bit of warmer tones to them, sometimes I would get them just right on the first attempt, but it's all good. I just found this first stage where I was kind of working on this large greyish area in between the clouds. I found that part to be the most difficult one, because once I actually got to drawing the clouds, things got a lot easier for me, because it was a little bit easier for me to see how much value I needed in which area of the sky and which colors I could use to achieve that. So for these clouds in the top left part, for example, I used some magenta and even some Prussian blue and some warm gray. So I experimented with colors a little bit, and then in the top here around the cloud I also used some pinkish tones, and I kept blending that with my tortillons. These are just regular paper tortillons that I roll myself, and like I said, they work pretty well on sandpaper, but you don't want to use them always. You just have to experiment with them a little bit. Sometimes you don't want to blend, sometimes you want to try to layer and maybe saturate the tooth of the paper with your pencil. Sometimes it's a good idea to blend. Sometimes you can produce some nice looking effects when blending, sometimes not so much. So I can't really tell you when to do what. You just have to kind of experiment a little bit. But here in this scene I did a bit more blending than usual. And this is the thing with colored pencils on sandpaper. They behave quite a bit differently than on regular paper, because even though they are still different than pastels and pastel pencils, they do behave a little bit more like pastel pencils on sandpaper than they do on regular paper, because it's a little bit easier to blend them and to move them around, and also to layer them. And of course the main advantage, I think, is the fact that you can work from dark to light, so you can easily add lighter details on top of the darker values, which is a huge advantage when drawing complex scenes. So on these lower clouds here, as you can see, I tried using some darker colors like this magenta, and I'm going to work with that on the top edge of those clouds, and then I'm going to gradually fade that or blend that into orange and reddish tones. I did most of that with a tortillon, and I also tried layering the pencils as much as I could. The good thing about these Faber-Castell, this orange that I'm using is dark cadmium orange, I think that's its proper name, so it's kind of a reddish orange, and I'm mixing that with this yellowish orange because I want slightly more reddish and even bluish tones at the top of those clouds, and then they're gradually becoming more reddish and orange and even yellowish as we move closer to the light source, which is the sun. So the good thing about these Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils is that they're rich in pigment and they have really strong, vibrant colors. But the pigment is also a little bit more difficult to move, and they tend to produce a bit more texture when you try to layer them. And that's one of the reasons why I used some other types of pencils here. I also used a bit of Staedtlers and some other, whichever I had lying around. And the reason why I used those was because they are a little bit easier to move around. They're also a little bit easier to erase. The colors are not quite as strong, but it's a bit easier to blend them, and it's a bit easier to achieve certain effects with them. So I just thought to myself, why should I just stick with one single brand when I can kind of combine a couple of different brands to get the effects that I want? Because I was stubborn here and I wanted to do this landscape in colored pencil rather than pastel. And of course pastel would make some of these things a little bit easier. It would also make some things a little bit harder, because one of the advantages of colored pencils is the precision and the cleanliness of the medium. But for these larger areas that you need to cover with a lot of vibrant colors, I think obviously pastel pencils would do a lot better job. But like I said, I wanted to work in this medium, and the only thing that I decided to do was to use a couple of different brands just so that I could use some of their advantages. So as you can see, I'm kind of gradually adding some more colors and even some of these smaller clouds on the above the horizon, and I'm kind of mixing colors. I I didn't have a specific plan here. I was just kind of experimenting with colors a little bit, trying to see what looks best. And around those edges of clouds where the sun rays would be hitting them, I made those lighter using an ivory colored pencil, because the ivory colored pencil is a very light colored pencil. It's almost as bright as white, but not quite. It's just a little bit yellowish. And for the lightest parts I used white. So those are the lightest pencils that I used for those lightest highlights or the lightest areas in my drawing. And then I used some pinkish or salmon type tones to go over these grayish tones, because I felt that they were a little bit too cool and I wanted to add some other tones to them. And then I also started adding a bit of this Venetian red. I think that's the one, to some of the clouds to get some even more interesting tones. And I also started refining the edges of these clouds and maybe breaking them a little bit into some smaller shapes, because I had a couple of these larger shapes which were kind of undefined a little bit, and I wanted to break them up a little bit so that they would make more sense, because these are three-dimensional shapes and you have to try to give them a little bit more volume and depth, and you have to try to make some sense out of them. So I'm back to using that same reddish color to add some more clouds at the top, and then I'm going over them with some bluish tones using this darker Prussian blue, and blending that with the Tutillian, and it's blending very nicely. I'm able to blend that in without actually creating too much texture. But the thing is that when you try to blend colored pencils on sandpaper and you're still getting texture, well, that just means that you need to use a bit more pressure. Sometimes you need to press quite hard against the sandpaper, and the good thing about this sandpaper is that it's a very, very durable surface. You can do whatever you like with it. And by the way, this is not regular sandpaper, it's waterproof sandpaper. It's a very fine sandpaper, 1000 grit. I find that 800 to 1000 grit works pretty well with colored pencils. And now even finer ones like 2000, they may be a little bit too fine, because what I found when I worked on those ones was that I actually found it difficult to add lighter details on top of the darker areas sometimes. So 800 to 1000 grit works pretty well when working on sandpaper. And if you want to try some higher quality, artist quality sanded papers, then probably the closest thing to this would be an 800 or 600 UART sanded paper. That would probably work pretty well. But this is a very cheap alternative, and I've already done quite a few drawings on it, and it works pretty well. And I like working with colored pencils on sandpaper. It's a very enjoyable experience. It's a completely different experience than working on regular paper, which can sometimes be a bit too slow and sometimes even kind of frustrating, even though I have to admit that this part where I did the sky and the clouds was also kind of slow here with colored pencils, because I did a lot of blending and layering and trying to get the right tones. Maybe it's also my lack of experience when drawing these types of things, because I don't really draw that many sunsets or sunrises where there are a lot of these vibrant, interesting colors. But I think I managed pretty well in the end, and it's starting to look good as I'm moving on to the right side of the sky. And once I finish that, I'm going to be able to move on to the horizon and the trees and the foliage and things like that. Something that I'm quite a bit more familiar with and a little bit more comfortable with, and that's why I'm probably going to be able to do that much quicker. But I still enjoyed drawing this landscape, even though I was slightly out of my comfort zone. I again used some magenta and some bluish tones for these clouds on the right side, and making sure that I have enough contrast against the lighter parts of the sky. Now here I actually decided to add some sun rays, and to do that I simply dragged one of my lighter pencils over some of the clouds, and for that I used this yellow color pencil from the Staedtler range. And the reason why I picked Staedtler here was because I knew that it would be a little bit more transparent and it would produce less texture. And here and there I dabbed on that with a brush a little bit to make it a bit smoother, but I kept working with that yellowish colored pencil because I thought that it was producing a pretty good effect. And then to make those sun rays a little more interesting and a little more warmer, I added some warmer tones like a light peach and even some pinkish tones here and there, because the sun rays, as they're glowing out, they're kind of modifying the color of the clouds behind them. So sometimes the color is going to appear more yellowish, sometimes a little bit more pinkish, so I wanted to include those variations. I'm back to using this Venetian red in combination with this magenta and Prussian blue for some of these darker clouds, or some of these edges of the top edges of the darker clouds here on the right side. And I'm even adding some grayish tones on top of that, and even some black for some of the dark tones, because I felt that some parts of those clouds I wanted to make them even darker, so I pushed in even a little bit of black, and then I went over that with a bit of Prussian blue, and I thought that I achieved some interesting looking effects. And the reason why I had to do that was because I wanted to make those clouds look a little more three-dimensional, like there are some shapes, smaller shapes in front of the other shapes inside those larger shapes. So I basically divided those larger shapes into smaller ones, and here I used the magenta to go over the top edge of the clouds to create even more contrast with that highlight, with that lighter area where the sun is breaking. And then I worked around the edges of the clouds which are facing towards the light source to make them even lighter, and to make everything a little bit more consistent with the light source. And I also refined the appearance of some of these sun rays on the right side as well. This doesn't have to be perfect. After all, it's a freehand drawing, but I did my best to try to make them look kind of like straight lines, I guess. And after that I moved on to the lower part of the sky, nearer the horizon, where I'm going to have some warmer tones, these orange and reddish tones, but I had to be careful to work around the highlight in the middle because I didn't want to touch that. I wanted to leave that area to be the lightest area, or one of the lightest portions of my drawing, and I kind of worked around it, adding these orange and reddish and even some pinkish tones here and there, and making a transition towards those magenta purplish tones at the top. And as you can see, much of the drawing process focuses on drawing the sky, because I found the sky a lot more complicated than the rest of the scene. After I had done the sky, it was easier for me, because after that I added some bluish and grayish tones to the horizon, and then even some magenta on top of those tones, because I wanted the distant trees to be catching some of those warm tones from the sunlight. but I made those pretty dark and also kind of undefined because they are way back in the distance. And after that, after I defined that horizon, I started drawing some shapes or some outlines of the canopies, which will be in front of those which will be closer to us. And here, of course, I had to draw the water, because this sunrise scene takes place over a river, and because the light of the sun is reflected in the water, this area in the middle is going to be the lightest and also the coolest, I guess. But then it's going to be gradually getting a little bit darker, with a little bit more of these pinkish tones and some other reddish tones on the sides. And I also have to make sure that this is fairly smooth so that I remove as much of the texture as possible. So I had to use more pressure with my tortillon. And I added some of the tones that we can see, and some of the colors that we can see in the sky. I added those in the surface of the water just to make the scene more consistent and more realistic. After that, I started drawing some trees, some shapes of trees in front of the horizon, and these are closer to us, these are closer to the foreground. I used a yellowish green, something like an olive green, but this is a darker olive green, and then I went over that with a black colored pencil to make sure that these look pretty dark, and to make sure that they're facing away from the light source. I also poked a few pinkish holes in those trees to make it look like the light of the river behind them is coming through, because those canopies are not completely opaque, they are letting some of the light through. And I also made some indications of some branches and some tree trunks here and there, just to make the structure of those trees look a little more interesting and a little more realistic. Around them I also drew some smaller bushes and maybe some shorter trees. And I also decided to add some more trees here in front of that sunrise going over the horizon, just to create a feeling of depth, because it's always a good idea when you're drawing landscapes to stack your elements one in front of the other, because that adds a lot, not only to the realism but also to the feeling of depth in your scene. So here we're going to have some more greenish tones, but I'm also going to try to apply some of those reddish tones that I used on the sky, but it's mostly going to be these yellowish green tones for the foliage and the grass. And I did the same thing on the right side. I used a combination of that green and black, and after that I decided to add a dirt road here going from that river bank all the way up to the foreground, and maybe there's another smaller path joining it from the right side. After that I covered this large green area where there will be mostly grass. I again used that olive green for that large green area, and I blended that with a tortilla. And while I was blending it, I was also getting some interesting tones, slightly different tones, slightly different from my pencil, but that's okay. And then I added some pinkish tones to the dirt road, because I wanted some of that light to be reflected onto the terrain. And I added some shadow around these trees, and then I started adding some shadows on the sides of the road, and also drawing some indications of grass and some variations in that terrain, that grassy terrain, maybe making some indications of clumps or clusters of grass, maybe some variations in shape and terrain. And I also added some grass in the middle of the dirt road here and there, just to make everything look a little bit more irregular, like it's just a country road. I softened the texture in those parts of those grassy areas which are a little bit further away from the viewer, because I wanted more texture in the foreground. And I also added some lighter areas here in the foreground to break up this straight line of that dirt road, of this dirt path, so that it would look more irregular, like it's not completely straight, like maybe it's winding a little bit, and in some places it's overgrown with grass, and maybe there's a little bit of rough terrain here and there and things like that. Just a little bit of variation in the terrain, and keeping in mind that I want to have a little bit more texture in the foreground than in the background, or rather in the midground, because those distant trees are, I guess, our midground, and the area that I'm working on now is the foreground. I even used some lighter yellowish green for some of the lighter grass, but then after that I added some reddish and orange tones to this grassy area, because I wanted some of those lights from the sunrise to be reflected on the terrain, so that it would make more sense. I even used some pinkish tones on that as well. And I also wanted some brownish tones on the dirt road as well. Now here on the right side, as you will see, I'm going to do the same thing with the grass, basically add some indications of clumps of grass here and there, just to make the terrain more interesting. But I also decided to add a few bushes in front of this road on the right, because I wanted the composition to be a little bit more interesting, and I wanted to add a few more elements here in the foreground, just so that I could create a better feeling of depth. I wanted some objects in the foreground there which would kind of push back that area and give us a feeling of distance and depth. Now for this for these bushes, I again used a combination of that yellowish green, that olive green, darker olive green, and I went over that with some black colored pencil, creating some texture and some shadows, because the way I use a black colored pencil on top of those green areas is to try to create some texture that kind of looks like foliage, but also to break it into some smaller segments, because I don't want it to look like a simple shape. I want the shapes to look a little bit more complex, like they consist out of multiple segments that kind of form around the branches of those bushes or trees, whatever it is that I'm drawing. And naturally after that I started adding some more indications of grass, of these darker blades of grass or shadows in between the clumps of grass, using a black colored pencil, basically trying to wrap things up with the foreground. And the good thing about colored pencils is that on sandpaper is that they blend pretty well. So when you use black in a combination with a color like, for example, green here, they actually tend to blend pretty well, and you can produce the tones that you want. And I kept adding some of these reddish and yellowish tones even to this grass area, just so that I could have those hues present in different parts of my drawing. But these are, I think, the finishing touches, as I'm pretty much done with most of my scene. I'm just kind of cleaning up some of these areas around the dirt path, cleaning up some of the edges and adding some of the final details. But the drawing is almost finished. This is also an opportunity for me to remind you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Give me a like and comment and let me know what you think. My drawing is almost done. I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner to wrap things up. I'm going to put some videos in the end screen, so if you want to check out those, that would be good. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process of this little color pencil landscape. So thank you for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.